And we said to them, do you understand how horses learn? And they went, of course we do. We're equine vets. We spent our entire life around horses. Of course we understand how they learn. And then we tested them on it. And then we said, do you understand the term positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement? And lots of them said yes. And then we said, does this statement correctly describe positive, negative reinforcement, positive punishment? And they got them all wrong. They were really not great results. So you kind of went, well, we've got this link between people that think they understand how horses learn, but they don't, and horse behaviour causing them lots of injuries.
Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of Changing Rein. This week we actually have one guest and two episodes. Our guest this week is Dr Gemma Pearson, who's internationally recognised as veterinary behaviourist in the equine field. She combines a job as Director of Equine Behaviour at the Horse Trust and running a referral clinic for equine behaviour cases at the University of Edinburgh. She graduated as a vet from the University of Glasgow. She did a residency at Edinburgh. She has a certification in clinical animal behaviour, and she did a PhD on stress in equids undergoing veterinary care, and most importantly, developing interventions that would positively influence that experience. She supervises students, and she's recently been recognised as the first species-specific expert in veterinary clinical behaviour at the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. She's invited frequently to lecture internationally. She has a very busy schedule and she's an excellent communicator, as you will hear in this podcast. One of the projects that Gemma was involved in that really transformed things for me was a series of short videos called Don't Break Your Vet, which she produced with the British Equine Veterinary Association, which helped reduce the stress around injury rates dealing with difficult horses. She's also an accomplished equestrian. She's competed up to advanced level in endurance, and she enjoys affiliated dressage and eventing. And she's currently retraining a thoroughbred who recently retired from racing. The reason we have two episodes this week is, as I said, Gemma's an excellent communicator. She has a lot to say. And rather than dividing the content in half, we decided we would offer two versions. The version you are listening to today is Gemma Pearson Uncut. She describes her journey into veterinary medicine, which wasn't straightforward, and the things along the way that brought her to her position of preeminence today. We hope you enjoy it. If you have any comments or queries or suggestions, please contact us at team@changingrein.com.au, as we love to hear from you. We're delighted this week to have Dr. Gemma Pearson on the podcast. Gemma is a veterinary behaviourist, equine behaviourist. Gemma, tell us a little bit about how you ended up where you are. Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, so that's quite a long story, I guess. None of my family have anything to do with horses, and even now they just do not understand my obsession. But I started riding at a riding school once a week, classic Saturday morning, when I think I'd been 7 or 8 years old. And that was at Eastern Park, which is a council estate in inner city Leeds. I went there, absolutely fell in love with horses. That was the highlight of my week. And unsurprisingly, that eventually closed down because the council, the value of land so close to the city centre. We used to ride the horses out and we used to hack them down this dual carriageway. And then we used to go onto there's a school and the school football fields at the back, and we could cant around the edge of the school. But wow, when you look at how close it is to the city centre, it's kind of amazing that we managed that. But so that closed down, and I went on to another riding school that was a little bit further away. As soon as I could talk, when people said, what do you want to do for a living? I wanted to be a farmer or a vet. And it was clearly going to involve animals. And I just had this passion for animals generally. So I was then lucky enough, a friend said, she goes to this riding school. Does she want to come up and ride my friend's pony? So I went up to a livery yard and we went out for a hack. She was on another horse and I rode her pony for her and just, absolutely loved it. I got back and said, oh, do you want me to groom her? Do you want me to help muck out? Do you want me to get the water buckets? And all of these sorts of things. And she said, oh, well, I have lots of kids come up and ride, and once they've done riding, they just want to go home again. Whereas she's clearly got the passion for caring for horses as well as the riding. So I don't know how, in hindsight, they managed to persuade my dad, and I think I was about 12 at the time, to let me get a pony on loan on this livery yard, and said they would keep an eye on me there. So that's kind of how I got into horses. And that was when my father had decided that I should be a vet, not a farmer, because he thought it would be easier for me to get into, and he thought it would be financially more lucrative. I mean, he clearly doesn't have that great an idea about how much vets actually earn. But he had persuaded me that being a vet was the right way at that point in time. And I think I was coming to that conclusion myself anyway. So I duly applied for vet school. Didn't get in the first 2 times I applied. I didn't even get an interview from anywhere, and was quite despondent about that. That was probably a bit of a tough time because I was so passionate. But what I would say is sometimes people will say to me, oh, I always wanted to be a vet when I was young, but I wasn't intelligent enough. And I kind of think I'm not the most intelligent person, I'm really not. And I think so many things in life, if you want something, you make it happen. And the 3rd time I got some more help with my personal statement. I got 3 interviews out of the 3 vet schools I applied to that time, because a lot of them wouldn't let you apply a 3rd time. And I got 3 offers. So I was kind of a bit spoilt for choice at that point. And again, I think it just shows that, if you want something to happen, you've got to make it happen in life. And so I decided to go to Glasgow. I visited Glasgow, Edinburgh and Bristol for the interviews. And Glasgow was the one where they probably spoke more about the bars and the social life and the kind of drinking. I thought this sounds like my cup of tea. One of the other things, just before I'd kind of gone to vet school, I was seeing practice as a small animal vet. And he said, oh, what do you want to do when you qualify? And I said, I want to be an equine vet because horses are my passion. And he said, no, he says, they will never accept you in the equine world. He says, you drink pints of lager and you go to football matches, and you have, I had a very strong Leeds accent at that point. I don't really anymore. And he said, the equine world will never accept someone with your background. And I just want to say that is just not true. That was his biases. He was a lot older. And actually, I don't think it's, my background has been particularly detrimental in the equine world. But it did probably send me in with a bit of a chip on my shoulder that not only was I getting into vet school, but I was going to be an equine vet. And then just before getting into vet school, because I didn't get into my 3rd attempt, I actually worked for a vet called Richard Kopak in Doncaster. He was an equine vet. And I worked as a kind of personal assistant for him. So we'd go around in the car. I would keep the car stocked up with drugs. So I became really familiar with drugs and doses and things like that. I used to write all of his clinical notes for him. I used to hold horses or scrub for, prepping for joint blocks and things like that. And I just learnt so much. And it was about 18 months that I did that before I went off to vet school. And one of the things, that was when I really got interested in all of these tricky horses, all of the ones that were a bit needle shy, the ones that came into the clinic and then wouldn't load to get home. And I think I'd always had an interest in training and behaviour, but this really sparked my interest. And Richard was a lovely guy. So he was kind of very laid back. He was never aggressive and he kind of also wanted to find better ways of dealing with these tricky horses than physical restraint. So of course, at the time, that would have been very early 2000s. And Monty Roberts was the kind of, if you want to know anything about behaviour, that seemed to be the thing. So I went off and I kind of did some courses and learned a bit about that and started playing around with drawing up with a few horses and got some good results. I started learning a bit more about horse behaviour. But there was massive pushback. The people that were engaged were there, but the vast majority were not interested. And then I kind of thought, well, that's fine. I've gone off and I've done this join up, and some of these now I describe them as fearful horses, then had a bit more trust in you. And obviously I understand now a little bit about why some of these processes were happening, which I didn't understand at the time. I was just seeing some results. So But I thought, but I've now got this warm blood mare at home. So I'd had, as I said, this lovely little Arab Cross Welsh 13-2 gelding as my kind of first pony on loan. And he was just amazing because all the stupid things I did with him. And I didn't die, which because he was pretty sensible about life. And then I got this warm blood mare, and she was 15-1, and she was, again, the nice next step up from it. She was still fairly safe and sensible, but actually she was incredibly aggressive to other horses when we were out riding, and she broke one of my friend's ankles. She kind of kicked other people. We took them to hospital thinking they maybe had a fracture, and it wasn't. And so she also wouldn't load. So one of my dear friends used to take us to dressage competitions, and sometimes we'd be there for an hour, 2 hours at the end trying to get this horse back in the trailer. And, so I was kind of thinking, well, I've gone off and I've done this Monty Roberts stuff, with some of the cases that I've seen through the vets. But actually, for my own horse, I kind of went, I'll do join up. It made no difference to the loading or anything else. And we still had all these needle shy horses and other things. So then I kind of came across the Pirelli stuff. I thought, okay, let's give this a go. And again, I did my kind of exams in Pirelli. I remember I was desperate to get my level 2 before I went to vet school, because that seemed to be the one that people were struggling to achieve at the time. And I did it with this mare, and it completely transformed her. And I also used it for some of the cases I've seen through the vets for loading and things like that. What was really telling was this mare went from, I used to dread the warm-up arenas, because everyone rides just looking at their hands, in a dressage and a jumping warm-up arena. And I knew if anyone came within about 6 feet of us, she would try and kick the horse, despite having red ribbons everywhere and everything. So I did all of the Pirelli stuff. And again, at the time, now I understand a lot more about controllability and predictability and negative reinforcement. At the time, I just didn't know why it was working. And I ended up going to a natural horsemanship dressage and jumping competition, and I warmed up with no bridle and no saddle, and there were other horses trotting past her within a foot of her, and she was just calm and relaxed. And so you think, oh God, this is amazing. And I kind of went off to vet school and was doing a few things with horses around there, and then I came across equitation science, and I think that was one of the real light bulb moments for me. So I started vet school in 2004, and I think it was when I was in first year that I was kind of first introduced to this concept. And all of a sudden, I could understand, because again, with the Pirelli, I would think, well, it's working for me, but why is it not working for someone else that's trying to do the same techniques? And once I understand the principles of training, I then realised that I was using negative reinforcement correctly, but a lot of other people were still thinking of it about dominance and being the leader for your horse. And so actually they weren't focusing on the timing and the shaping and keeping the arousal levels low. So that was just a massive light bulb moment for me, understanding the concept of negative reinforcement and understanding all of the principles of training. And I then started to incorporate that as I was doing things through vet school. And I went off after I graduated to what was then the Australian Equine Behaviour Centre. It's now Equitation Science International, and spent some time with Andrew and Manuela McLean, and just learnt an awful lot about that. At the same time, I obviously graduated as a vet. I moved back to Leeds. I was working in practice, absolutely loving it, but always knew I wanted to go on and do more. So I thought, well, I really like medicine and I'm quite a caring person, so maybe I'll do a medicine residency. And then I ended up going up to Edinburgh and doing an internship, and at the same time I moved in with my partner at the time, which was a farmer, and they had a stud where they were breeding Black Arabians for endurance. So I kind of had some exposure to different methods of foal handling and stallion handling and some other different aspects. And I did my internship at Edinburgh, and then I was going to apply for the medicine residency. And John Keane was head of the hospital at that time. He's a medic and a cardiologist. And he kind of got me into his office and he said, so you're thinking of applying for the medicine residency? I said, yes. Why do you want to do that? And I said, because I love medicine and I love, looking after the colics, and I'm really passionate about it. And I said, okay. And he said, what are you going to do at the end of your medicine residency? I said, I'm going to do all my behaviour research. And I think he very rightly picked up on the fact that, I was already running a bit of a behaviour clinic through the University of Edinburgh. And to do a medicine residency, to do the European diploma route, your papers have to be in medicine, your publications. And he said, I'm not sure specialising in medicine, if really you're going to go down the behaviour route, is the best career thing for you. And I thought, well, he's got a point there, but there isn't a European college for behavioural medicine at that point. Now, of course, we do, although it's really for small animal behavioural medicine. They don't have an equine track yet. That's work in progress. So he said, well, what if we did a rotating residency whereby you spent most of your time in medicine, you did your certificate in advanced veterinary practice in medicine, but you also spent quite a lot of time in orthopaedics because, there's this kind of link between pain and behaviour and orthopaedic pain specifically. But then you run a behaviour clinic. And I rotated through the other services as well, of course, but it was mainly medicine and a bit of orthopaedics that I spent my weeks on. And then he said, well, for your MSc through research, we could focus that on all of the behaviour stuff. And I thought, this sounds absolutely perfect. So we did that. And that is where I first met Professor Natalie Warren. She had just moved back to Edinburgh at a similar time to when I started there. And, it continues to be an inspiration to me throughout my life. She's been an amazing friend and mentor. And, of course, when we started talking about MSc topics, I said, oh, well, maybe I could come up with some way to tell the difference between whether it's pain or a behavioural problem, and then we kind of said, well, maybe that's a bit beyond an MSc project. So I then decided I was really interested in needle-shy horses and all of the problems vets have when trying to administer veterinary care to horses. And I was really curious to see how frequently vets were actually injured by horses that they were working with, and then to see if we could have some sort of intervention and change what was going on there. So we decided we'd do that. Just as I was kind of getting things together, Beaver actually decided they were going to do a massive large-scale study, which was Tim Parkin's study and run through the University of Glasgow, looking at injury rates in vets. And initially I was a little bit crushed because I thought, oh no, this was my plan. This was what I was going to do. So I kind of got in touch with Beaver and went and helped them collect some of the data at Beaver Congress one year. And actually it worked out really well because, obviously Tim's an excellent epidemiologist. And the way the team of people looked at the data was way beyond what my MSc work was ever going to do. And I did do a survey looking at how frequently vets were injured, looking at their understanding of learning theory, and then looking at how they approach difficult horses. What was really interesting was that first of all, they were all injured very frequently, exactly the same as in Tim's study. And we said, injuries that are caused by the behaviour of the horse. So not crashing your car because you've worked too many hours and you're tired. And we said to them, do you understand how horses learn? And they went, of course we do. We're equine vets. We spent our entire life around horses. Of course we understand how they learn. And then we tested them on it. And then we said, do you understand the term positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement? And lots of them said yes. And then we said, does this statement correctly describe positive, negative reinforcement, positive punishment? And they got them all wrong. They were really not great results. So you kind of went, well, we've got this link between people that think they understand how horses learn but they don't, and horse behaviour causing them lots of injuries. So we then said, well, could we have some sort of intervention? Could we do something differently? So I took the fourth year vet students just before they came into final year, and we sat them down and we gave them this PowerPoint presentation with it was like a survey that had videos embedded into it. And we would say, you're a new graduate, you're asked to go out and vaccinate this horse, which is reported to be quite difficult. This is what happens. And I'd show them a video of someone walking into the horse, touching its neck, and the horse rears up. And then we asked them all these questions about how big do you think the risk for injury is? Would you feel confident in this scenario? How likely do you think you would be to actually vaccinate this horse on this day? And then we asked about the motivation of the horse and what their approaches would be and other things. So the entire year group did that. And then we gave them one 45-minute lecture, which was an introduction to how horses learn. And, as you know, I've got lots of videos of these sorts of scenarios and explained about negative and positive reinforcement, explained about shaping and monitoring the arousal levels of the horses. And then we did the post-test. So again, we had the same cohort of students and they watched exactly the same videos in the survey as originally. And you always expect people after an intervention to say, oh, be more confident, more likely to succeed. And that's why it's really important to have a delayed survey. So if you do one immediately afterwards, the scores are always improved. That's just what you expect. But if you wait, and we decided to wait until they had spent their rotation in the equine hospital. So it was on the last day of their rotation that they got an email for that group. So some of them, it was after like 3 months, but some of them, I think it was about 9 months afterwards. And what I expected was that they would be all enthusiastic after my lecture and think it was all going to be really easy. And then when they spent a month in the real world in the hospital, they would go, well, maybe it's not quite that easy. And the scores hopefully would be higher than baseline, but would be lower than the immediate. And it actually, for the most part, was the other way. Most of them were actually felt safer and more likely to be able to do it after their time in the hospital. And we got some really nice feedback from students saying how, and now I should say we always actually have a vet, we always have an intern on the yard when students are doing checks, but in those days we didn't. So the students were saying, I went down at midnight to deal with these horses, and one of them, which makes me think it was probably a non-horsey student, but I love this term, she said, we went to give the horse its oral medication and it started head bucking. And I thought that's exactly what they do, isn't it, when they throw their heads back? Like, love that term. And she said, we were worried because we thought this horse might rear and, we might get injured, but we used your techniques and it just stood still and put its head down and we could give it the oral medication. And I probably hadn't realised how many students were struggling out of hours. And what was nice is I guess what I didn't get was the feedback from the ones that said, oh, we tried it, it didn't work. But, there were enough that said that it did work that made me confident that this was the way forward. And it also made me wonder how many horses, because we weren't getting a lot of feedback from students saying we couldn't, I was a resident at the time, and I don't remember being phoned by students saying we can't worm this horse, it's midnight or it's 4 a.m, we're giving it oral meds or injecting it, or they'd certainly ring you and say we can't flush the catheter, which was always one of those things to get out of bed. It's a little bit frustrating for, but I just thought, well, I'm not getting wrong that often about difficult horses, and it started making me think, how often are these horses actually getting these meds sometimes? If these students, if they are coming across these problems, and I think I'm sure like it'd be very, very rare that they weren't. Then anyway, what was nice about that was the feedback from the students was strong enough that the university then decided to incorporate it into the normal curriculum. And I started off with 2 hours for fourth year, and now I get them in first year, second year, fourth year, and a bit in final year. So we're just continuing to get more behaviour into this. And so kind of getting towards the end of my residency, and what was really clear was that I had all of these questions about how horses learn and equine behaviour and the link between pain and behaviour and, all these different things. And the answers are just not out there. So, of course, the next logical thing is to do a PhD and go and find the answers for yourself. So I did my PhD, which was investigating the stress response of horses undergoing veterinary care, so understanding it from their perspective, and then the development of low-stress handling techniques. And again, Natalie Warren supervised me. We also had Kathy Dwyer, who's an amazing behaviour and welfare scientist, come on board. And what was really interesting, and it was similar through my MSc as well, so I had Nat and in my PhD Kathy as behaviourists. And often when I was writing things up, they'd say, well, you don't need to explain behaviour in that depth because anyone that's reading a behaviour paper is going to have that basic understanding. But all of this veterinary stuff, you need to explain that because people won't get it. And then I also had 2 vets so John Keane and Richard Reardon, and they would go, look, Gemma, vets reading this paper, you don't need to explain all of this veterinary stuff because they're going to get that. But actually what you really need to do is explain this behaviour stuff, because we've got no idea what this means. And it kind of highlighted to me this massive gap between behavioural knowledge in that field and veterinary knowledge in the veterinary field. And clearly I wouldn't expect behaviourists to have the veterinary knowledge, but I would expect vets to have a basic behavioural knowledge. So I did my PhD, learned a lot about stress and how to measure it and how not to measure it and the limitations of that, and then came up with some of these things. You know, one of the nice ones was classical counter conditioning for nerve blocks, because we know that that is one of the riskiest procedures. When you have a lame horse and you're sticking needles in their legs to localise that lameness, lots of vets get really nasty injuries from that. And we were able to show that by using classical counter conditioning, the horses were getting less stressed the more work we were doing with them. So that was all really nice. And of course, at that time, I was also the veterinary liaison officer for the International Society for Recreation Science. So really understanding how the organisation works, the direction things were going in. And I think you mentioned this before me, that was also when the British Equine Veterinary Association said, well, we've done this survey and we've realised that vets are getting injured. And I think one thing they'd hoped at the start was that they would show that actually if you sedate horses, it's safer. And it would be some evidence to encourage owners to pay for sedation. But of course, what they found was that there's lots of needle-shy horses that you couldn't sedate. So whilst obviously sedation is something we should be using more of, someone said, well, you should get Gemma to help with this. So we filmed the Don't Break Your Vet series, which just took off. Like it really surprised me just how powerful that was. And I think even now I get vets from all around the world. In fact, Goulburn Valley Stud actually shared a link to it just this week and tagged me in it, and kind of saying to their owners, you know, you can practice some of these things with your horses and it makes them safer for us. So I think that was a really nice, and that shift in the veterinary world from the horse is being naughty, we have to punish it, or we have to restrain it because it's painful and there's nothing we can do, to saying, well, actually, no, we can rather quickly train horses to accept procedures that they want. And I think it was kind of at the end of my PhD, of course, I was still seeing behaviour cases throughout that. And I did my CCAB, so my Certified Clinical Animal Behaviourist qualifications, and I really got interested in behavioural medicine. And I would really distinguish between low stress veterinary care, which is something that all vets should know. And actually, I mentioned the Don't Break Your Vet campaign, but more recently, we have just at the end of last year, we actually launched the Hold Your Horses, which is low stress veterinary care. So anyone that's a member of the British Equine Veterinary Association can do this course and get a certificate to say they've got a certificate in low stress veterinary care. And I think that's about 3.5 hours with some MCQs at the end. And what was nice was the Don't Break Your Vet series were really short videos, so people watched them, but they couldn't go into enough detail. Whereas I think with this course, we go into enough detail to set vets up for success in dealing with these more tricky cases. And as I say, I then really got into behavioural medicine and understanding, like I say, you've got the low stress veterinary care, and that's one thing. Behavioural medicine is a completely new kettle of fish, and it's something that I think is quite new to the equine veterinary world. So whenever I see a case, I now tell people off if they say, is it pain or behavioural? I say, well, you're asking the wrong question. And I probably use a model which was really developed by a small animal behaviourist called Sarah Heath, whereby we say, what evidence do we have for cognitive pathology? What evidence do we have for emotional pathology? And what evidence do we have for physical pathology? And it's not that it's either one or, it's usually a combination of all three. It's certainly two of them. And then you treat all of those aspects individually. And I probably should say, in terms of where I'm at now, when I finished my PhD, I was employed by the Horse Trust, which is a fabulous charity. They funded my PhD. They're one of the biggest funders of scientific research, equine scientific research in the UK. And they then offered me a job at the end of it. And they did say, you're going to move down to the south of England to Buckinghamshire. But actually, for what I do, I'm based at the University of Edinburgh still, and I run a behavioural medicine service, which, as I've said, we're looking for those links between cognitive, emotional and physical health. And so I need a team of experts in orthopedics and medicine and soft tissue and dentistry around me, because I could not do my job without, those to bounce these cases off of, and also the academic environment. So where I'm at now, I'm employed by the Horse Trust. I am based at the University of Edinburgh, and I explain my time is split into 3 areas. So one is running a behavioural medicine referral service, and I do see cases all around the UK and even some internationally. I then do outreach. So I travel quite a lot, and I try and kind of spread the word about low stress veterinary handling, and now the behavioural medicine links. I'll go and lecture and go and train vets in their practices and things like that. And then there's the research. So we have some research grants. I have a PhD student. I've got lots of master students from time to time, and my own research ongoing.
Absolutely fascinating. The first thing I wrote, 2 things I wrote down at the very start was intentionality. You didn't just let things kind of happen. They kind of, you knew where you wanted to go, and I think that is important in life. Some of us kind of sit back and wait, but you didn't. You just went for it. And the other thing is 2 words: steely determination. I mean, you absolutely you knew where you were going, and it was going to happen. But look at the results. I just think that's amazing. Maybe, if you wouldn't mind, and I think our listeners might be interested in this, you talked about Monty Roberts, you talked about Pat Borelli, and how you what you know now is different to what you thought then. And I think our listeners might be interested in a little bit about that, just to explain, as I say, your current thinking.
Yeah, and I think they're also kind of updating their thinking, and we all do the best we can with the knowledge we have at the time, don't we? And I think if it wasn't for people like Monty Roberts and Pat Borelli, there wouldn't have been the gap for me to come in and start these things. They were in a very different world to the one I started in, and I'm in a different world to the one that the next generation will be. But obviously, Monty Roberts, initially a lot of the focus was on this join up method, and they kind of said, well, this is how horses communicate with each other, and you move them round the round pen, and then when the horse sees you as the leader, they will show these behavioural indicators of dropping the head and licking and chewing, and the ear becomes focused on you. And then when they do that, if you take the pressure away, the horse then comes in and follows you because they think you're the leader. Of course, now what we understand is that a lot of it is negative reinforcement. So there was one study where they did this with a remote-controlled car. And even though the remote-controlled car has no body language, so they put quite a lot of emphasis on your body language when you're approaching the horse and when you turn away. And I do think that is important. Horses do pick up on how we are. And I know Andrew McLean had kind of said about people that are just naturally quiet and slow around horses. The horses tolerate that a lot more than these intense, energetic people. But they did it with the remote control car, which can't change its body language. It can either move towards the horse or away from the horse. And the horse is joined up with the car in the same way. So you go, okay, so it's not just leadership, it's not body language, it's this release of pressure. And we talk about the kind of 4 modulators for stress, and the 2 that are really key are controllability and predictability. And I think this horse starts to learn, this is the behaviour that I perform to take the pressure off here. I think as time has gone on, there've been some discussions about things like licking and chewing. They would often say, oh, that's the horse trying to communicate. Now, of course, we understand that that's the horse going from high sympathetic nervous system drive to parasympathetic nervous system drive. So it means something a little bit stressful has happened for them to come through that. And certainly, I used to work with difficult horses and say, oh, they're licking and chewing, there's lots of licking and they're learning a lot, they're thinking about it. And now there will be a lot less of that. I don't think people go to the extreme, don't they? They then say, oh, licking and chewing is bad because it means there's stress. Well, stress is a normal, healthy part of life. So some is good, but not excessive. And then again with the Pirelli, the Pirelli was based on these 7 games, but they would still use these words about dominance and leadership. And again, these games were very much focused. Both of these things really came from an ethological background of saying this is how horses communicate with each other. And actually, it's not really. Horses don't play these same games with each other as what was described. But it's all about negative reinforcement. And the one thing I think Pirelli does really, really well, and other natural horsemanship techniques, is that concept of shaping the behaviour. So say you're doing the exercise where you want the horse, I think they called it the yo-yo game, to step back when you wiggle your finger. Well, you start off and you wiggle your finger for a couple of seconds, and the horse has got no idea what that means, so they just stand there and ignore you. And then you wiggle your wrist, and then they start to feel the rope move on the halter, so there's kind of an awareness, but they still don't know what you want. And then you wiggle your, from your elbow, and then your whole arm is going. And by this point, this is really uncomfortable for horses. So most of them step back, and they really emphasize the timing of the release. As soon as that horse starts to step back, you release the pressure, and the rope drops. And then you start again, and you just wiggle your finger. So you're going through this process, and through classical conditioning, the horse can predict that after the wiggling the finger, the rope pressure is going to start, and it's going to increase until they step back and it stops. So then you start wiggling your finger, and the horse just starts walking backwards. And it all looks really harmonious. But we can explain it all with learning theory. And we shouldn't talk about things like respect and dominance when it can be really easily explained through learning theory.
One of the things that I think gets misunderstood too a little bit, Gemma, with that whole the round pen work is the fact that the horse actually can't leave.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, so again, this kind of, I could bring this into some of the stuff I used to do. When I first understood the concept of negative reinforcement, I would go out to see a case that was difficult for the farrier. And when you went to run a hand down the horse's hind leg, it would kick out. So I would go, right, well, I'm going to run my hand down its leg, and I'm going to keep it maybe at the stifle area, and this horse can be kicking out, and I'm just going to stay out of the way, and I'm going to keep my hand there until the horse stops kicking, and then when it stops kicking, I'm going to take my hand away, and the horse will learn that kicking doesn't make the hand go away. So that's negative reinforcement, but that's using it in a really mechanical way, and it's not accounting for the horse's emotional state. And one thing it's slightly challenging now is I'm still showing the same videos from about 15 years ago, because when a video case is now, it's like watching paint dry. If I had a horse that kicks out now, I would start off and I would run my hand along its back, and as soon as I felt the horse starting to tense up and be aware, I would stop there and take my hand away before they lifted the leg up. And so it takes a little bit longer. It's still not long. You're still talking like 2 minutes, 5 minutes maximum to train a horse to allow us to handle its leg and lift it up. But people, if they watch that, will go, well, that horse was fine. You took your time getting there, but that horse never had a problem, unless you can show them a previous video. And so I think it's a similar thing, with the Monty Roberts technique, whereby obviously if you were to put horses, and obviously Monty did have a wild horse that he then had to ride another horse to keep up with it. But if you weren't riding another horse and you had them in a massive area, they would just run away. If you went to chase them, they just, they can run so much faster than us, and they can keep going for so much longer than we can. So as humans, we always use tools to make our life easier. So you could put pressure on a horse, and the horse could run, and this pressure wasn't the changing because the horse couldn't increase the distance from it. And again, I think, the more this has gone on, people have actually, like, the amount of pressure they use and the amount of chasing has reduced dramatically, because they've realised that all that happens is the horse associates this fear response with people. And that's where I'm at, with my hind leg and my kicky horse. Yeah, I can keep my hand there, and it can keep kicking there and take my hand away when it stops. But that horse has just practiced fear and frustration whilst I've been in proximity to them. And that's not the way we want to go forwards now.
That's such a good description, Gemma, and I think it shows the evolution. And I think that's something that's really important for people who are listening, is that, you know, Mita and I talk a lot about the journey, and and I think I really liked how you said we do the best that we can with the knowledge that we have at the time, and yeah, so I think that's just, remember, if you're feeling bad that you've been doing things in the past that you think, oh, maybe I shouldn't have done that. That's part of the journey, and as long as we're trying to get better.
Completely. And I think this is something, I'm sure we've all seen those graphs where they talk about the number of publications that include the word horse or equine and welfare. And it's an exponential curve. It has just gone, and I actually looked this up for a pony club project. And in the kind of 1800s, you'd have like one publication and then another one 5 years later. And, you know, there's very little. And then it's just exploded. And there's always going to be that gap between scientific knowledge and what occurs culturally in the general population. And I think the fact that the welfare literature has exploded means that people that are up to date with that, there's this massive gap between culture and that. And I'm sure it was a similar thing, you know, when all the literature was coming out about smoking causing lung cancer. And of course, lots of people were saying, oh, no, don't be ridiculous. And well, there's a massive industry that relies on smoking, on selling cigarettes. And I know someone that smoked and they lived to be 100. And, you know, there's all these things. And more evidence came out. And there must have been people banging their head against a brick wall going, look, this is killing loads of people. We need to change this. But people just continued. And it takes a long time for culture to change. And even now, I mean, smoking is rare in the UK now. And yet I go into Central Europe and culturally everyone smokes, you know. So when it comes to horse welfare, I think we need to remember that there's this massive gap between where we are at now and the culture. And also that it's always going to be a continuum. There's not one thing where you'll go, right, well, this is when we've achieved good welfare, because that's going to change over time. Obviously, I'm employed by the Horse Trust, and the Horse Trust founder actually read the Black Beauty, and of course that was one of the first books that described an animal as having thoughts and feelings, as a sentient being, and looked out at the London cab horses again in the 1800s and said, actually, these horses aren't having a great time. And do you remember one of the passages in Black Beauty was about the London cab horses and saying how when they got a loose box was such a luxury for these horses to be able to turn around, because they're all in tie stalls. And we know that these horses, you know, most of them were dying by the time they were 8 years old because they were severely malnourished and they were physically worked. They had sores, they trotting and cantering on hard surfaces. They must have had so much osteoarthritis. And the term for flogging a dead horse comes from the fact that these horses, if they did, you know, try and stop moving because they were lame or collapsed, they were just flogged until they moved again. And at some stage, people would say, look, that horse is going to die in front of you. There's no point in continuing to flog it. And for us, I mean, that makes me feel physically sick thinking about the lives these horses led. But these people were doing the best with the knowledge they had at the time. And let's be honest, they were trying to feed their families. You know, the people didn't have a good quality of life. They didn't have the healthcare we do. They didn't have heating or good nourishment. So we look back on that and we go, okay, so actually if you look at a modern sports horse now, their quality of life is amazing compared to these London cab horses. But I think in 100 or 200 years' time, people go, oh my God, can you believe that they used to keep these sports horses in an individual stable? You know, and they didn't understand learning theory properly. So people sometimes used to hit a horse with a whip because they perceived it as being naughty. And, you know, we'll just look back on this and we'll be horrified at some of the things we did. But we need to accept that different people are on different stages of that journey. And I've kind of tried to go, you know, you said about make things happen. I definitely, you know, I decided that I was going to change the way the veterinary profession dealt with needle shy horses. And that there was no compromise there. But I've learned a lot from doing it, that actually telling people they're wrong. And I guess this is one of my other light bulb moments. So one light bulb moment was understanding negative reinforcement and educational science. Then it was starting to understand shaping and emotional states in horses. And then the most recent one has been doing some work with the likes of Tamsin Furtado and Inga Wolfram and understanding human behaviour change. And that has just revolutionised the way I deal with my cases and a little bit my approach. Because I had started off, and I am very driven, and I can be a strong personality. So I kind of at times said to people, oh, that's wrong, I'll show you what's right. And I never got to show them because they were, you know what, this is still a little blonde Yorkshire girl, you know, I was very young at the time, and they're like, well, I've been involved with, you know, horses for 50 years. How dare you tell me I'm wrong? And you think, okay, that's not the way forward. And where I really made a difference was, you know, I had this needle shy horse, and some of you may remember this horse because actually one of you ended up in hospital last time. This is me injecting it. And I didn't say what you did was wrong. I just showed an example and just went, this just worked for me. And then people ask you questions about it and they're coming to their own conclusions. So yeah, I don't know if I've gone off on another tangent there.
No, what you've said is kind of encapsulates what we're trying to do in this podcast, because I'd be like you, I'd like to just change the world. It doesn't work like that, you know. So we have to bring people with us. We have this metaphor of a tent. Anyone who's interested in horse sport is welcome in that tent. We might not agree with everyone, but we'll chat to them, and hopefully together we'll all make progress. But what you said about the continuum and the gap, the emerging gap, I suppose, or increasing gap between the academic knowledge and culture, that's a kind of a worry, because that exponential curve is not stopping anytime soon, and it's trying to bridge that between what's in the literature. And Karen and I have talked about this, about maybe doing some small little segments on new papers that we think people might find interesting. Where do we start? There's just so much. My Google alerts every week are just hopping with stuff that could be relevant. So
yeah. Well, can we start with one that Gemma wrote?
Yeah,
today.
Let's do that.
Let's start with one that Gemma wrote today, because I reread it, and I'll confess, I was really disappointed in myself because I'd read it before, but then I'd kind of forgotten about it. And it was the paper that she wrote about box rest. So it was really interesting, Gemma. And one of the things that really struck me was this notion of reactive coping that you talked about, and where horses appear to be coping with something they find quite stressful, and in this case we're talking about box rest, but they actually have stress levels that are similar to horses that aren't coping. Can you talk a little bit about that and explain that? Because I think that's something that I've heard people say, oh, my horse copes fine in the box, he doesn't care.
Yeah, so I think, again, you've got that knowledge gap between what's in the literature and what's culture acceptable. So people would often say a horse isn't coping with box rest because it's cantering around the box and trying to jump over the stable door. You're having to put a bar up to stop that, or it's screaming constantly. Well, that's an extreme level of not coping. When animals are subject to a stressor, they have a physiological and behavioural stress response. And the behavioural stress response can go down an active coping mechanism or a reactive coping mechanism. Now, if you would say to people, what's the stress response? People say fight or flight. Well, it is, but you're forgetting a few other bits. So, yeah, horses will normally avoid, and even when we talk about flight responses, it's quite extreme by the time the horse is actually physically leaving. Avoidance is the first way they'll deal with things because it's easier. But we have this flight response. Fight responses, aggression in horses, the only two times we really see true aggression in horses is two stallions fighting for mating rights that are very evenly matched, and that is really rare. Normally one stallion goes, I don't think I'm going to win this battle, I might as well live to fight another day, I'll just back off at this point in time, I might try my luck next year, or I might buddy up with another stallion and maybe the two of us can get this harem. And then the other one would be mares with newborn foals or young foals. And I'm sure, Mita, you've done a lot of stud work. That is one of those areas where you just have to be so careful, because the instincts, even in a really nice mare, to protect that foal are so strong. So aggression is just not a normal thing for horses. And people talk about the fight response. And this is something I've really tried to get across to vets, because when they go, oh, that horse will have you, it's really aggressive, and you're going, well, what other options does it have? And in the small animal behavioural world, they talk about the level of bites and bite inhibition. And, there's obviously the ladder to aggression in dogs, where they talk about the low rungs on the ladder are these little lip flicks, and, the tail's slightly tucked and they're turning their head away. And people miss those. They see that the biting on things. And I think in horses, it's the same. They have all of these behavioural indicators that they're not coping and they can't leave. This is a key thing. They're restrained because they've got a head collar leader upon, or they're in stocks, or they're in a stable, and people are in front of them. And then they build up through these different levels of aggression. And even people get really annoyed because they go, oh, the horse kicked me and I've got a small bruise on my leg. And I'm like, well, if you consider that horse was obviously trying to signal that they weren't coping, but they withheld the amount of force. If a horse, that'd be funny, even a small horse, if they really want to kick you, you've got a fracture. You are leaving in an ambulance. So the fact that the horse, and they'll usually kick out once or twice before they make contact. And then when they do make contact, they still have what I describe as kick inhibition. They don't put the full force in. They're going, I'm doing everything in my power to signal that I can't cope, that I need distance without trying to hurt you. And then eventually they do kick. And the only horses that are really aggressive are the ones that have been forced into compliance on multiple occasions. And they've gone, well, there's no point in using these lower levels of the ladder because it never works. So I need to go hard straight away. Anyway, I'm digressing. So we have flight, we have fight, which if it's occurring, we've probably done something wrong. Then you have fidget, and we're still on active coping mechanisms. And people don't recognise fidget very well in horses. But this is the horse that is kind of calm and relaxed. And then you take it into the exam room. Maybe it's calm and relaxed in the exam room. And then everyone comes in and starts getting ready to block it. All of a sudden, the horse turns around. They scratch their sides. They rub their nose on their leg. They start rubbing their head up and down the person that's holding them, which can be really uncomfortable. The horse is trying to actively distract themselves from the stress that they are feeling. They might want to go and sniff something on the floor, or, they're trying to do something to cope with the stress. They can't run away, and they're trying not to be aggressive. So we should recognise that. But anyway, so that's your active coping mechanisms. Then we talk about reactive coping mechanisms. And originally they used to call this passive coping because it's usually a freeze response, or it's a reduced behavioural output. But now they describe it as reactive because they only use that up to a certain extent. So if you think about the classic rabbit in the headlights scenario, you're out at dark, you shine a torch on a rabbit and it freezes. So the rabbit's strategy is don't move, stay perfectly still. If they haven't seen me, they'll move away and I'll be safe. But you can't walk up and pick a rabbit up off the ground that's doing that. Because at some stage you get close enough that they go, this coping strategy isn't working anymore. And then they revert to an active coping strategy, which is, of course, running away from you. So when we talk about horses, and this is something I see, and I'll come back to box rest in a minute, but this is something we see in the veterinary world, whereby horses have maybe tried to fidget in, they've been told off for fidgeting. They can't have a flight response because someone's holding them with head collar and leader up. They don't want to do a fight response because, they don't want to be aggressive towards people. So then they freeze. And they're really tense and they're really still. And they just hope that whatever's happening, if they just do nothing, it will just go away again. The problem with the freeze responses, whereas with the aggressive responses, you can see them going up this ladder, and the speed at which the leg comes up and kicks out is getting greater each time. Then it makes contact, then it makes more forceful contact. With the freeze, you don't see any difference. So internally they're escalating, but externally you don't see anything. And then when they go, okay, now I'm going to switch from freeze to flight. Now, if you were to approach a rabbit in a field, they'd probably kind of just hop away if you were at a great distance. Once you get too close, they dart away. And this is where these horses suddenly explode out of these freeze responses, and that's when people get hurt. So going back to the box rest scenario, some horses try and actively get out of the box. You get that barrier frustration, you get box walking, you get weaving, you get horses putting their chest into the door. Some of them are screaming. You've got all of these different forms of active coping mechanisms. But if they don't work, a lot of these horses then withdraw and they become more subdued and they go into a more reactive coping mechanism. And this is where externally people often go, oh, they're fine because they're not screaming and running around. But actually, these horses are really not feeling very good about life. And the paper you talk about was a clinical commentary. So it was off the back of a case, and I can't actually remember exactly what the fracture repair was. Was it humeral fracture?
Something like that, yeah.
It maybe or femoral. Anyway, it was one of the bones we're not normally very good at repairing. And they kind of said, oh, well, we manage this horse, and I think he had something like 9 months of box rest. And this is where, as vets, we talk about the 5 domains model. Vets are really, really well trained on the health domain model, and they go, well, this horse was going to be euthanized because of this fracture, and we've now treated it successfully, and everyone's happy. And that's fine. That's great that the horse is still alive. But what was the impact of box rest? And one of my MSc students, Kath Featherston, actually sent surveys out to horse owners and to vets asking them about box rest, and it was amazing, the differences in the perceptions. So the vast majority of vets thought that box rest didn't cause any harm to horses and that they coped with it fine, whereas the vast majority of owners, I think was it over 80% of owners, said that there can be significant changes to the horse's personality as a consequence of box rest. And then the owners were saying all of these things that they saw that the horses were struggling with when they're on the box rest, but they actually don't ask the vets for advice. So the vets have no awareness that owners are struggling with this. One of the other things was that the owners, if they thought their horse's welfare was compromised, they would go against veterinary advice and turn the horse out in the field. But if they thought their safety was compromised, they would continue doing the in-hand walking and things because that's what they perceived was best for their horse's welfare. And that, for me, that was quite scary. The owners are going, well, yeah, and I know so many people that have had horrific injuries trying to walk horses in hand that have been on box rest. So we're kind of realising that vets maybe aren't aware of just how stressful box rest can be for horses. They go, well, if it's healed physically, it's fine. And the purpose of the clinical commentary was not to say don't put a horse on box rest. I mean, clearly in that case, the horse would have been dead if they hadn't have done that. But it's actually to say, well, if we know that this is a problem, what can we do to mitigate that risk? And of course, in that fracture case, it very clearly had to be on very strict box rest, because if the fracture explodes, then you've got a dead horse. But I think as vets, we go to box rest a little bit too easily. And we've actually got another Beaver project we're working on at the minute, where we're going to come up with a resource for vets to help them mitigate how to manage horses on box rest with happier horses and happier owners. And it's trying to understand, well, what is the purpose of box rest? So I was in New Zealand last year, and they had a horse with a full limb bandage on that was out in a field. In Scotland, that's problematic because, it's going to rain. The bandage is going to get wet. It's going to be a disaster. New Zealand, he was fine. So it's trying to go, well, are we trying to limit movement? If we are trying to limit movement, how much are we trying to limit movement? Can the horse walk and gradually graze up and down, or do they need to be on strict box rest? Do we need to keep it clean and dry? Do we need to, if it's a laminitis case, do we need to kind of keep them off the grass? What is the aim of that?
And in that commentary, Gemma, you had a really ingenious sort of a solution, which I thought was really ingenious, which was your boxes joined together. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I just thought that was so clever, and I think it's something that's so relatively easy for most owners to implement with some hot tape.
Yeah, exactly. So this actually was something I first developed. I had a lovely little dun and white gelding that was given to me because he had some significant challenges with his ridden responses and was quite dangerous. And he had a suspensory injury and had undergone a lot of box rest and had kind of, I think, nearly 2 years off work and a bit of rehab and things before I was involved with him. And he was given to me on the proviso that he never did box rest again because of the impact it had on him. And then he had an injury, which a lot of equine vets will be familiar with, these dorsal hind limb injuries. So it was in front of the hock and just below onto the cannon bone, where he'd actually severed one of his extensor tendons. And they're quite common injuries, and they heal fine. But you have to, if he goes running around on them, then it's not going to heal. So first of all, we had to keep him in for a couple of days. We had a bandage on and everything. And again, rather than keeping him stable, I kept him in a kind of indoor pen, which was just easier for him. He could just move a little bit. Then it got to the stage whereby we could turn him out, but what I didn't want was him trotting around on this. So traditionally, vets will often say, they have to stay in a stable. Then after that, then go into a half tennis court sized paddock, and then they go out in the field, and they'll give you a period of time for each. And for this horse, I said, I could put him out in a stable sized paddock, but they graze that for a little bit, and then they can't go anywhere, and they churn it up, and they just get bored. So I connected, I think, 6 or 7 different stable sized paddocks using electric tape together. And the gap between each one was all on alternate sides. So it meant that he could maybe get a stride or two of trotting across each little square, but then he was kind of going around the corner, and then he'd get a stride, and then he was going around the corner. So he's having to come back to walk to get through these little gaps. And I found that when we use that, the horses just quietly graze and wander up and down, and most of them never trot at all. But mentally, it makes a huge difference to how they feel. And then you can move on to these kind of half tennis court size. And again, you can put multiple ones of those together. Now, if you had I usually have like a 4-foot gap, a normal stable sized gap for them to get through. They would be a longer period of time. So sometimes we'll have, obviously you'd have to look at the diagram, but kind of 2 bits of tape. So they have to go through like a narrow passageway into the next paddock. So they have to come back to walk to go into that next one, but then they can wander around in that. At that size, you can usually put another horse in with them fine. So it's thinking outside the box, pun fully intended, about all these different things we can do with horses to help them be less stressed on box rest.
Yeah, I just thought it was such a clever way of sort of solving the problem, and just another example of where there's a will, there's a way. So if you make up your mind that there has to be a different solution to this problem, you can almost always come up with a really clever way of doing it. And I just thought that was just such a wonderful thing that could help so many horses that, get injured every day, that, need to be contained for their own health, but mentally it's just so challenging for them. But what a clever solution. And lucky in Australia, it's very dry. So we don't have the problem that you guys have in Ireland and Scotland.
Yeah.
Gemma, there's so much we could talk to you about. I'd love just a quick summary of where you're at with your QBA work and looking at racehorse behaviour, because obviously that's an area I'm particularly interested in. Would you like to tell the listeners a little bit about that?
Can I just jump in? Sorry, Gemma. Can you explain QBA? Just because not everyone, I think, will necessarily know what it is. Yeah. Yeah,
of course.
Sorry, Gemma.
The challenge is but I'll try. So one thing I would say is I am passionate about horse sport. I am the girl that when badminton horse races is on the telly, my life stops. If I'm not going, my life stops, and I just come down and I can watch every single horse go around the cross-country course. I was in Amsterdam last week, and I could watch every single dressage test and watch horses. I could just watch horses, athletic horses, for hours. So I do think there is a role for horses in sport. And of course, I work as a racecourse vet. So we all talk about welfare, and welfare has these negative connotations associated with it. We talk about it's a welfare case, which means it needs to be seized because the horse has been, neglected. Its quality of life is unacceptable. But welfare really means how you feel. It's the mental feeling. So that can be on a scale from very good to very bad. And in horses, and I know you've discussed this in previous podcasts, when it's very good, It can be very good with a high level of energy. So horses that are playing or they're rolling in the muddiest puddle and they're just having the best of lives. But also, I remember Pip Funnell saying this in a webinar, and someone asked her about happiness, and she said, well, I think I'd use the word content. And I really get that. The horses that are grazing with the sun on their backs, they're just calm and relaxed. So both of those are really positive emotional states, but with different energy levels. So we put in some funding to Hong Kong Jockey Club, who very kindly granted us the provisional funding to validate QBA in racehorses. So QBA is Qualitative Behaviour Assessment. It was developed by a lady called Francois, who's at SIUC, which is also at the University of Edinburgh. It's the same campus. And she's used it extensively in farm animals, loads and loads of different farm animals. And it won the BBC Food and Farming Award. So what's really nice is it just gives us a great insight, and it's always going to be an insight. We're never going to know exactly how an animal is feeling, but QBA is incredibly sensitive. So the key thing to understand about QBA is it's evaluating how an animal does something, not just what it is doing. So traditionally, from a behavioural science point of view, you would have your ethogram, and you would go, is the horse laying down, standing, walking, trotting, cantering, galloping, rolling? It's got to be doing one of these things, jumping. But if the horse is trotting, it's trotting. Whereas with QBA, you're going, how is it trotting? And we all know the difference between the horse that's having a bit of a yee-haw and is trotting and picking their knees up and enjoying life a bit around the field, versus the one that's just quietly meandering from one place to another, versus the one that's really stressed. And the one that's really stressed will also be picking its knees up, but you can see that muscular tension in it. So for the first part of this study, what we did was first of all, we went into a lot of the racing yards in Scotland and spoke to the stakeholders, and they are so passionate about welfare. And again, it comes back to, these people are doing the best they can with the knowledge they have at the time. And so we kind of got their perspectives, and we got lots of videos of racehorses with high energy levels, low energy levels, positive mood state, negative mood states. And then we showed these videos to the stakeholders within racing and said, well, what terms would you use to describe their emotional states? And they came up with all of these terms, and there's some quite complicated ways of, because each person then scores the videos using their own terms they generated, and eventually you look for general themes and you come up with a list of terms that everyone's in agreement with, and we have kind of focus groups to make sure we've got that agreement. What was interesting for racehorses, this is the first time that the term tired has come up as a standalone term. And I just think that makes perfect sense, because if you're looking at dairy cattle and pigs and other aspects, you're talking about how bold they are, how playful they are, how stressed they are, how painful they are. But actually, when horses are working and working hard to physically develop, the good trainers come round and they go, that was a really hard workout. They look at the horse a couple of hours after they've raced in the box and they go, let's back off for a couple of days. And others, they go, that horse doesn't look like it's worked at all. Let's increase it. It's probably ready to increase its training. So the next stage we've developed this fixed list of terms, and we validated that against other behavioural tests. So the next stage, which thankfully Hong Kong Jockey Club have very kindly funded again, is to roll this out on a larger scale within racehorses. And we're going to have an app that people can measure these terms. And again, one of the reasons we went for this was because Francois had done this with farmers through Waitrose, and the farmers that they'd had really good engagement with it. And I thought, if you can get farmers to get their phones out and score things on an app and start to think about how their animals are feeling, we're going to be able to do this with, and it's not just trainers, of course, it can be the jockeys, the stable staff, the work riders, anyone that's involved with horses, and getting them to start to think about how the horse feels. And so they'll have this fixed list of terms, and then you have a scale from minimum to maximum. There's no numbers on it, and you just drag how far along you think that goes. It then undergoes some more complicated statistics, and it tells you how that horse is feeling relative to how it's been feeling in other contexts, or how it's feeling relative to other horses. And one of the key things is that it's not a fixed number. So you can't say this is a welfare of 8 out of 10. That just doesn't exist. And that comes back to what we were saying earlier about, the London cab horses compared to where we are now, compared to what we might be in another 100 years. So you can go, well, these horses are the happier horses, the ones with the best, more positive mood, and some of them are high energy and some of them are low level of energy. But these are the kind of outliers. These are the ones that are not as happy. And again, that may be high level of arousal and energy, or it may be low. There's talked about that, reactive coping mechanism where they're withdrawn. And then you go, right, well, how can we improve those ones and move them into the centre of the pack? But then your pack spreads out more. So now you've got different ones that are at the low level. But the really nice thing about QBA is that you're not just looking for welfare problems, you're looking for the best welfare as well. And I think that's why a lot of trainers were engaging with it really well when we started this, because they want to show where their animals have positive welfare states. And if you go on, to farms or race horses or sports horses, and you start telling people, well, that horse isn't happy and that's a problem and this isn't good enough and this isn't good enough, people shut down. If you go on and you go, okay, so we're going to do and this is where, the word well-being starts being used, because people are so scared of the word welfare, even though, we shouldn't be. You say, we're going to do an overall evaluation of how the horse is feeling. We're going to find out where your horses are happiest and where there's, maybe they're not quite as happy. There's room for improvement. People are enthusiastic. And I think when the farmers used it, they would sometimes go, well, actually, when I do this is where the highest scores are coming up. But also now that I'm spending more time just looking at how the animal feels, I'm recognising that the cows are happier in that context. So, and it may be things like the those big brushes that look like they're from a car wash. And they go, well, actually, the cows are really happy when we're using them. And, I've got one in that shed, but they're kind of queuing up to use it. So why don't I get another two? And then they go, oh, look, they're all using them all the time. And so it's positive reinforcement for the people that are using it, because they start thinking to themselves, they feel good about themselves. They're not just being told where they're doing things wrong. They're finding out for themselves where they're doing things well.
I love that positivity. I just love the idea that, they're looking to the positives rather than knocking the negatives. And I suppose it leads on to a final question. How do you see the future of horse sport? You say you love all horse sports. We've been coming under pressure from various sources in the last few years. Are you optimistic? Like those cows or like those farmers?
Yeah, I am optimistic. I'm optimistic with the proviso that we need to make some pretty significant changes. But I think we will. Like I say, I came from a non-horsey background, and there's just something about horses that drew me to them. I enjoy hacking, but I really like training horses. And I like sitting on athletic horses and feeling that power. And competing horses, I'm very competitive, albeit, other than endurance, it's all been at a kind of a low level. And I believe that horses, I think if we were to say, okay, well, we'll just turn horses out into hundreds of thousands of acres of woodland and mountains and streams, they've got a really enriched environment, but that's not going to happen. And then when we start keeping them on what's more feasible, so smaller paddocks, and I do have a problem with these tiny individual paddocks that some horses go out in. But even when horses are out in, say, a 5-acre paddock, it's still a 5-acre paddock, and that we choose which friends they have. They're not, exposed to lots and choosing them themselves. And that's where I feel like we know horses get dopamine spikes when they're learning. And by training horses, and for me that would include riding them as well, I think they can get a lot of enjoyment out of that. And, my horses, when they're not injured, which they seem to be quite frequently, I train them for dressage and eventing. And so they're learning, and I think learning is stimulating. But also then we go out hacking in the Scottish mountains, and again, it's a stimulating environment. it's exposure to lots of different things. So I do think horse sport needs to change, and that's where this gap between culture and knowledge is really vast at the minute. But I think it will change. And I dealt with a show jumper for a friend of mine that's in training for William Whittaker, and this horse was kicking the walls in his box, and he was quite an unhappy, quite a stressed horse. And he is, he's bred to be an athlete, and he is a more sensitive horse, which is perfect for leaving the show jumps up and responding to the cues really well. But what was really nice was I made some suggestions. Again, think about the COM-B and the human behaviour change. We said, right, well, this is the areas that we could improve. How can you achieve that on your farm? And they went, well, actually, we have got these pens that we keep the broodmares in, and we've got a ring feeder in the middle with a large bale of haylage in, and then we just split this pen into 4 using electric tape. There's no electric through it, and they've got this larger area, but it means that the horses can groom each other over this tape and touch noses when they're eating the haylage and things, but they've also got their own space. And so he's called Arnie. We put Arnie in this setup. Arnie stopped kicking the walls. But what was really nice was that his trainability improved significantly, to the extent that William Whittaker has then invested in new facilities so that his other top show jumpers have more to facilitate them allowing social contact with other horses. And he feels that, his other horses have jumped a bit better off of this. So obviously it's always hard in horse sport because there's a financial drive. You have to be trying to win, and your horses have to be achieving to get there. But actually, when horses are happier, the people are happier. And I think it does ultimately improve performance. So once people have started, I've never seen anyone that's started turning horses out or started giving them social access and done it sensibly, that has then reverted back and gone, no, I don't want to do that anymore. Once they see the difference in the horses, they all invest in it. So on that road, I am optimistic. And I do think if I look at what dressage tests looked like a few years ago and, some other things, I think we're seeing massive improvements. And I think people sometimes expect it to be like flicking a switch and all the horses will just look perfect. But we're seeing more open frames, the nosemans aren't as tight as they used to be. For me, everything's going in the right direction.
That's a very positive note to end this episode, Gemma. And can I say that, I talked about your steely determination, but when you were talking about horses in all their different situations, I could feel your passion and your enthusiasm for them, as horses. I just thought that came across so well. It's something I think we all share, but it's just lovely to hear it articulated by someone who's, obviously, at the top of their profession in this world. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. It was great. It was such a good episode. So thank you.